Good morning and welcome to Light Reflections from First Friends. We are glad you have chosen to join us for this virtual worship service and hope you find it beneficial to your spiritual journey. We consider this an abbreviated version of our in-person meeting for worship for those wishing to join us from a distance. If this is your first time joining us, First Friends is a thriving, progressive Quaker meeting in the city of Indianapolis, Indiana. We consider ourselves a loving, inclusive, joyous gathering of people seeking to know truth under the leadership of God's Spirit. All are welcome, no matter race, age, cultural background, sexual orientation and identity, marital status, physical and mental ability, family structure, or economic circumstance. Our hope is that through this worship experience, you will discover our faith community is unlike any other, where silent meditation is as important as the spoken word, where we emphasize the importance of one's personal encounter with the divine, and where we seek to support one another as we discover truth together. Now we invite you to center down and enter this virtual worship space with us.
How could anyone ever tell you you are anything less than beautiful? How could anyone ever tell you you are less than whole? How could anyone fail to notice that your loving is a miracle? How deeply you're connected to my soul. And how could anyone ever tell you you are anything less than beautiful? How could anyone ever tell you you are less than whole? How could anyone fail to notice that your loving is a miracle? How deeply you're connected to my soul.
Good morning and welcome to Light Reflections. This morning our scripture text is a familiar one from John 1, 1-5. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. As I mentioned in As Way Opens a couple of weeks ago, I started 2022 reading devotionally the book Church of the Wild by Victoria Loers. There are many great things that I could preach on from this book, but one chapter specifically struck me and had me rethinking and even deconstructing some of my former theological understandings. It's not too often these days that I read something that has me engage in a way that chapter 6, in the beginning was the Logos, has had me these first few weeks of 2022. In this chapter, Loers is focusing on the phrase, "In the beginning was the Word." Now, this is a statement we have all read or heard for most of our lives from the very beginning of the Gospel of John. I've taught on this poetic text, I've preached sermons on it, even spent hours writing papers on the theological constructs that come from the idea of Jesus being the Word, or as in the Greek it reads, Logos. Where it hit me was when Loers began her research on the word Logos. I love doing research on words and phrases. Part of my education has been all about this research, as it is very important work for pastors when trying to interpret the wisdom of the Scriptures. Yet, what I had been taught all my life, I have realized had taken somewhat for granted. If there was one interpretation that I accepted as true without researching it, it was, in the beginning was the Word. The Word was the given and proper English translation of the Greek word logos. At least that is what I thought and had been taught for most of my education. Loers helps give some background to the origin of the word logos and its interpretation over time. She says, logos was first used in a cosmological way by Heraclitus of Ephesus, a Greek philosopher in the 15th century BCE. He used the word logos to articulate a kind of intelligent life force embedded in and interconnecting all things. A divine reason implicit in the cosmos, ordering it and giving it form and meaning. Loers points out that Heraclitus developed one of the most revolutionary concepts, the idea that all things are one, or what they now label unitary nature, or an indwelling unity beyond the diversity in existing things. Logos is the principle or power that shapes and creates all things, immanent and embedded in all that exists. It is the relationship between all things holding them together. She points out that this is a concept that many great thinkers throughout history have connected with, just calling them by different names. Thich Nhat Hanh calls this the web of interbeing. Robin Wall Kimmerer calls it sacred reciprocity. David White calls it the conversational nature of reality. Quantum scientist David Bohm calls it implicate order. Even Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had a way of describing this logos. He called it an inescapable network of mutuality, which he said was tied in a single garment of destiny, meaning whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And not only great thinkers, but all the great philosophies of the world utilize this idea of logos. From the Stoics to the Chinese to even the Persians, this concept of logos is a universal concept that almost all philosophies teach and embrace. So what about the Christian faith of which we ascribe? Well, I remember when I was in undergrad college in River Forest, Illinois, and Sue and I would frequent a store in Oak Park, Illinois, which has since sadly closed. The name of that store happened to be Logos. It was an eclectic store filled with Bibles and Christian contemporary music CDs and religious trinkets. And in many ways, it was very much like the old Family Christian or Lifeway stores, but there was a difference. Mixed in among the books on the shelves were books from other religious philosophies and trinkets from other religions. On occasion, the students at our Christian college would get upset and seek ways to question the owners for their confusing selection of items. I remember one student even saying, "The store's called Logos. It's clear that it should be all about Jesus because Jesus was the Word." Until around the 4th century, most theologians and translators translated the Greek word logos into Latin, not English, because Latin was the official language of the church at the time. Logos in Latin, was translated as sermo. Now here's a surprising thing. When you and I hear the word sermo, we immediately think of the word sermon. Thus, it's easy to think why they would translate it into English as word. Yet the reality is that sermo does not mean word, but rather a manner of speaking back and forth, or simply a conversation. Sermo's roots is sero, which means to weave and join. It is the intimate living of life together, living among and all in intricate conversation. Apostle John wanted to connect to this understanding when he wrote his unique and much more metaphorical and poetic gospel. Many believe John was trying to be culturally relevant in how he saw Christ. He wanted to identify Jesus with the Logos, this divine indwelling through which all things were made. Early theologians and philosophers would have understood that John was trying to what John was trying to do, saying Logos had a relational dimension or force. It was a metaphor or descriptor for the embodiment of Christ's work, not the person of Jesus himself. This is more like when we distinguish between the President of the United States and the office of the President of the United States. One's about the man, Joe Biden, and the other is about the actions, the work, the impact, the legacy of the position. I consider Logos for us to be like the office of the greater conversation or relationship with our neighbors, the divine, even the natural world around us. When describing Margaret Wheatley's idea of turning to one another and embracing the need for and conversation with each other, I was inviting us to tap into this greater office of conversation and relationship. This means Logos is bigger than just the person Jesus. It's more about the title we give Jesus, that being the Christ. In Seeking Friends, we have been wrestling with Richard Rohr's latest work, The Universal Christ, where he speaks directly to the difference between Jesus and the Christ. Rohr says, Christ as such is not precisely a religious principle, but a life principle, the ubiquitous confluence of matter and spirit. Christ is not Jesus' last name, but the title for his life's purpose. What Rohr and Lohr's help us see is that Christ is about radical solidarity. Christ is the conversation happening between everyone and everything. Christ is not the word, but the conversation. Just listen again to our text from John 1, which I read earlier, but this time let me replace word with conversation. In the beginning was the conversation, and the conversation was with God, and the conversation was God. This was with God in the beginning. Through this conversation, all things were made. Without it, nothing was made that has been made. And in this conversation was life. and that life was the light of all mankind. The conversation became flesh and made its dwelling among us. Just let that sink in for a moment. Christ is the sacred conversation that links everything together. I once taught a class to mostly freshmen at Huntington University. It was an introduction to Christianity class and a required course, and as part of the curriculum I included a talk by Rob Bell, who many of my evangelical students considered a heretic. Ironically, this talk was more about a science lesson than it was a religion or theology lesson. During Rob's talk, he shares about how everything is made up of smaller and smaller things, all which must be in relationship with one another. This, he says, is the interconnection of all things. At our molecular or subatomic state, we are made of particles that have to be in relationship, or as some scientists say, in an ongoing conversation with one another to survive. Conversation and relationship is literally what we're made of. As we would watch Rob's talk, many light bulbs would begin going off in the heads of my students. They would wonder, then begin to make the connections first in the scriptures. Where 2 or 3 are gathered, there I am in the midst of them. A cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. 3 is the magic number. Well, I think you get it. When we turn to one another, as I said a few Sundays ago, and strike up a conversation with each other, our conversation becomes, as Laura points out, a holy space of exchange, a space in which I release some of what I used to think and be in order to include you. And we both are changed. As Quakers, we can embrace this understanding because when the God in me meets the God in you, we too are changed. It is when we don't acknowledge the God in our neighbor that we begin to break down the relationship and stop the vital communication. So why do we not translate logos as word today instead of conversation? Because since the 4th century, the patriarchs have been intentionally translating it to the Latin word verbum instead of sermo. Verbum is a noun meaning word, where sermo is a verb meaning conversation. Since language not only describes things but also produces culture, the patriarchs decided that controlling the religious world meant defining it by nouns, or what we would call things. Soon a successful life was about the pursuit of things. This is known as empire. It is into this male-dominated empire of things that Jesus of Nazareth is born, a man who comes with a revolutionary message that was all about resisting empire. Jesus came from the Hebrew people, whose language is verb-based, and who focuses in great depth on the relationship between all things. The Hebrew people were not about trying to define the substance of God. Instead, they were more about relating to and pleasing God. Actually, God was considered a verb to the Hebrew people. I am who I am, or as it should be more appropriately verb translated, becoming which will be becoming. As Lohr's put it, God is being, not a being. Well, most of American Christianity today is all about defining nouns. We have lost the conversation. Even me giving this sermon from the Greek sermo should actually be about a conversation with you, not just a lecture of sorts. That's why I try to offer queries that will continue the conversation throughout the week to help us engage our religious faith in a way that taps us into the greater conversation we are all a part of, the Logos. As Quakers, we speak of being light bearers, carriers of the Logos, the Tao, the spark of divine love within us. And as Lohr's points out, when we engage one another, when we choose to turn to one another, the conversation between us becomes the manifestation of the sacred, moving us forward to the ever-evolving kingdom of grace, and that is the wild Christ. I pray we at First Friends will work hard on embracing this Logos, or sacred conversation, that we will seek to be verb people instead of noun people, that as we have these sacred conversations, we will see the manifestation of God in our midst, in our lives, within each of us. It might just be a wild and unexpected ride, But first, we must turn to one another and start a divine conversation. If you want to continue to learn more about this, I highly recommend you pick up the book, The Church of the Wild by Victoria Lures. It would be a great way to continue the conversation. And I'm sure I'm sharing more from this book in the future. Now, as we enter waiting worship, I want to utilize some queries Victoria Lures poses to conclude this sermon. What would a wild Christ, a conversation who is the intermediary of love between all things, evoke in our world? Is it possible to imagine the worldview of kingdoms and empires transforming into a worldview of kingdom and compassion? And how might Christianity be different if it could become a place for sacred conversation, a place to explore possibilities and express doubts and disagree, and encourage voices on the edges?
Friends all gather round. There's something I would say, that what brings us together has blessed us all today. Love has made a circle that holds us all inside. where strangers are as family and loneliness can't hide. You must give yourself to love, if love is what you're after. Open up your hearts to the tears and the laughter, and give yourself to love. Give yourself to love. I've walked these mountains in the rain. I've learned to love the wind. I've been up before the sunrise to watch the day begin. I always knew I'd find you, though I never did know how. But like a sunrise on a cloudy day, you stand before me now. You must give yourself to love, if love is what you're after. Open up your hearts to the tears and the laughter, and give yourself to love. Give yourself to love. Love is born in fire. It's planted like a seed. Love can't give you everything, but it gives you what you need. Love comes when you are ready. Love comes when you are afraid. It will be your greatest teacher, the best friend you have made. You must give yourself to love, if love is what you're after. Open up your hearts to the tears and the laughter, and give yourself to love, and give yourself to love.
We close this time of worship with a Quaker prayer. God, open our eyes and unstop our ears, that we may see your light and may hear your heartbeat, reflecting and resounding within our chests, in those of all our neighbors, near and far, in all creatures and plants, and in the ground we walk upon. When we finally are able to yield to the leading of your rhythm and flow, may we come to walk cheerfully over the world, answering that of you in all. Amen. Have a great week, friends.